Good evening, City Church. Unfortunately, we are still um, filming service from home this week. I know last week we didn't have one as we started to hear that some of our families had gotten sick from various things, from COVID to other things, and we just felt it was important for us to just shut down the church and minimize as much as we could any further spreading of sickness throughout the church. And we've been praying for many of you guys, the whole church at large, and just hoping that everyone is doing well. And we can't wait to see you next week. Our plans at this time are that we'll get together next week, next Sunday. We'll start getting together in groups and for church services again, as long as people continue to get better, as all that we've seen so far is everyone is on the mend, and God has been faithful and good to us in that. And so we're super thankful. During these 2 weeks of being in quarantine at a much stricter level than we have been for the last year, as I put myself into quarantine, um, I was really faced with some of the control issues I have in my own life, really faced with some of the things that I say I want to trust God with, but really at the end of the day, I want to have control over the outcome and the way that the outcome comes to be. I really had to face some things in myself and then wrestle with the Lord and wrestle with myself over um, just areas of my life that I really don't have control over. And that can be terrifying and frustrating. And my flesh can want to blame other circumstances or other people for why I don't have control. But the truth is that I have to give these things to the Lord. And in that process, in the last 2 weeks, God took me back to an old story that many of us know, and I want to share it with you this evening, which is Jacob's story of how he came to finally walk in the promises of God and not try to control and produce them in his own strength and his own cleverness and understanding. For those of us that don't know Jacob, his story can be found in Genesis, starting roughly in chapter 24 to 25. And he is the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham, the father of faith. And God had shown up to Abraham early in his life and promised him great things and led him to a land far away from where he was raised, and promised him that his children would be like the sand on the seashore, and that anyone that blesses him and his offspring will be blessed. Anyone that curses them will be cursed. And that God would provide through his seed nations. And so there's this amazing promise that Abraham received, and his son Isaac walked in that promise as well. And then Isaac finally has two children, old in his age, much like his father was, has two children by his wife Rebekah, and they were twins. And it was Esau who was born first, and then Jacob. And so when Jacob comes out, the story goes that Jacob actually, the baby, reached out and grabbed his brother's heel during the delivery process. And they named him Jacob, which sounds like heel. And it's a euphemism of their day that someone that grabbed your heel or tripped you up was a deceiver. And so he gets this horrible namesake right out of the womb. But the Lord speaks to Rebekah and gives her word concerning her two sons and says that the younger will serve the older. And so we have this amazing prophetic word that Jacob is actually going to be the one that inherits the promises. And so for their life, Jacob and Esau, they grow up in this household. I imagine that this prophetic word has been known between the two of them, that Jacob ultimately will be the one that inherits the promises. And they grew up with Abraham as their grandfather till about the age of 15 when he finally passes away, and Isaac, and they hear all the stories of faith and how God has moved and God has worked. And so these two young men grow up and this atmosphere of expectation that God is going to do great things. And yet Esau takes after more of the men of his day and after his father's heart, becomes a hunter and a warrior and a strong, powerful man who works the fields and goes out into the forest and does manly things. And Jacob is more quiet and reserved. And actually we find Jacob in the story constantly with the women and making meals and working amongst the tents with a bunch of the women servants and his mother. And it says that his father Isaac loved Esau, yet his mother loved him. And so I can only imagine, and if you would come with me and just let your imagination go, is that there's these two men that have these prophetic words over them. And Jacob has this word of being great, but yet everything in his life is showing him to not ending up with the promises that were spoken over him. He's not the stronger brother. He's not favored by his father, who is the one who's going to give away his inheritance to the one whom he chooses and bless the one whom he chooses. Nothing's pointing in the direction that Jacob's going to actually receive what he was told he would receive. And I think so often in life, we can find ourselves in the similar situation where we read scriptures, and we understand the gospel, and we understand that God says he's going to do all these great things for us. But we tend to just find ourselves looking at our circumstances, maybe who we are, the things we've done in our past, and go, there's no way God's going to perform all these things for me. There's no way these promises are going to actually come to be in my lifetime. And so we find Jacob at some point after his grandfather's died and he's older, and his brother comes in from the field, and it says that he is just red and exhausted and he feels like he's going to die. And Jacob says, I'll make you a meal if you sell me your birthright. If you give me your natural inheritance, what's meant to be for the oldest son from our father, if you give me that, I'll make you a meal. And Esau goes, what good is my inheritance if I die? And so he says, sure, have it. And so Jacob gladly makes him a meal. His brother sustains strength. And Jacob inherits the firstborn inheritance. And it says that Esau just despised his inheritance from that day forward. Well, that wasn't enough for Jacob. He's already essentially blackmailed his brother out of his inheritance instead of showing grace and mercy to his older brother and just giving him a meal out of the kindness of his heart. And so when his father is getting old and had gone blind and didn't know how many days he had left to live, he says that he wants to bless his children. So he sends his oldest Esau out to the fields to go hunt. And Jacob's mother, Rebekah, hears of this, and because she loves her son and knows the prophetic word over his life, she goes, Jacob, come here. We're going to put hair on your neck because Esau was hairy. We're going to put hair on your hands, and I'm going to make you a stew out of the livestock we have, and you're going to go to your father, and you're going to steal your brother's blessing. And so Jacob fulfills the prophetic name that he was given as a deceiver. And he goes and he deceives his father. And his father hears his voice and knows it's not Esau. But Jacob says, no, it's me. And he touches him and he feels the hair and he smells him and he smells Esau's clothes. And he goes, surely you must be my son. He enjoys the meal and he blesses Jacob. Shortly after, Esau comes back into the tent. Jacob has just left, and Esau comes in all excited to feed his father and get the blessing from God that his father has on him. His father says, son, I am so sorry. Your brother Jacob has already stolen it from you. When his father realizes that his real son Esau is in front of him. And Esau cries bitterly and weeps and begs his father. And his father gives him a much lesser blessing, a blessing that actually feels more like a curse about being a servant to his younger brother. And he makes a promise that he's going to kill his brother. And so the drama has set up this moment that these two grown men are now at complete odds, and the older brother, who is much stronger, much more fit for war, is now out to kill his younger brother. And so their mother tells Jacob, you must run to my father's house, which is about 550 miles away. Remind you, this is on foot. There's not a car, there's no planes, no trains, no automobiles. This is a man who on foot through the wilderness has to trek, take his life into his own hands. A man who is accustomed to growing up in the tents and having things done for him, not one who survives by defending himself or hunting for himself. And he has to make this trek to go find her brother and his household for safety. And so he gets going, and he ends up falling asleep on the first night some ways away from his father's tent. And it says that God comes to him. And we pick up the story in Genesis 28, 10 through 22. I'll give you a moment if you want to come catch up with me there. It's this amazing time where God meets with Jacob for the first time, just with Jacob and not through the words of his father and grandfather. Genesis 28, 10 through 22. Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down his place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And the Lord stood above it, as the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. And the Lord said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust on the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And you and your offspring and all your families shall the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will be with you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you." Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he put under his head, and he set up for a pillar, and he poured oil on top of it, and he named that place Bethel, which means the house of God. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I've set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all you give me, I will give a tenth to you. It's amazing to me, the prophetic word and the history of his family. And in this moment, God speaks to him. He has this encounter with God, this powerful encounter with God. And he says, if you do these things, and if you go where I go, if you do what I do, if you bless me in what I choose to do, then, and if you stay with me and bring me back to this place on my timeline, then I'll call you my God. It's amazing the bartering with God that Jacob does. There's no humility. There's no part of him that's taking into account the lying and the lack of mercy he's shown, and the fact that he has done nothing with his life up to this point to earn anything from God. And yet now he's sitting here after this amazing experience, and he's demanding that God would actually move on his behalf. And he's telling God how it's going to be. You're going to go where I go. And if you do this, if you give me bread, if you give me clothing, if you bring me back in peace, then I'll call you God. Not the fact that you've just shown up and promised me this, not the fact that I'm still alive, not the fact that I have all this history of you doing great things with my father and my grandfather, but only if you do these very specific things that I'm choosing for me will I call you my God. We may not ever come to a place for many of us where we actually say these things to God ourselves, to where we look at God in the dire of our circumstances, where we have nothing. Because at this point, Jacob has a staff and nothing else. No donkey. He has taken nothing but a staff, and he is walking through the desert and the wilderness. And we may find ourselves in seasons like this, and we may never say what Jacob says, but oftentimes with the way we act towards the promises of God and towards pursuing relationship with him, we essentially say the same things. We lay out all these conditions in our heart that maybe we never speak, but they're unmet expectations in our heart. And we've said to ourselves within our own conscience that, man, God, if you don't do this, this, or that, if you don't show up here, or if you don't move like this, I'm not going to trust you with all of my life. And we do these things over and over again with our actions. We carry these expectations of what we want and how we want it and when we want it and who we want to share it with. And we have all these things that we expect God to do according to our understanding or flat out just to our desire. And then when the Lord doesn't fit our expectations just right, and he doesn't fit the mold that we've made for him, that we've put him in, we walk our own way. We do what Jacob does. We find ways to deceive ourselves into thinking that we can actually come to a place of owning, or we could come to a place of working out the things we want in life in our own strength. And so then we begin to wander like Jacob did. We begin to wander through this life just trying to strive and struggle to get the things because we've never come to a place of really trusting God to do what he said he's going to do, because it didn't work out quite like we thought. Jacob was told that he was going to rule over his brother Esau at this time in life, and yet here he is running with no possessions, nothing in his land. His life is on the line, and he has nowhere to go but to his uncle's house, who he has never met. And it probably feels to Jacob a lot like God has let him down, that the things promised to him, the things his mother told him growing up, are never going to come to be. And he is now putting God in a position to act as he wants if he's going to let him rule his life. Have you ever done that? I know I've done that. I've made barters with God, and I've come to places with God, especially in my days of severe depression in my early 20s, of telling God, if you don't do this, I'm not serving you. If you don't deal with this, Lord, how can I trust that you're even God? If you don't meet me here, if you don't change this circumstance, if you don't, I just can't trust you and follow you. And so we find ourselves, I think a lot of us like Jacob, dealing with the disappointments that are really based on our expectations, not based on God's promises. And we have to come to a place where we learn to wrestle with ourselves over what's really true. What have we actually done? And what have we actually caused in our own life to end up in the places that we've ended up? And it's interesting that Jacob then, he finishes his travel. If we get back to the story, he finishes his travels. He gets up, he meets Laban, and he comes in to work with Laban, and they set a deal. And he sees one of Laban's daughters, his cousin, and it's Rachel, and he goes, oh my goodness, she's beautiful. I'll work 7 years for her. And his uncle tricks him, and they celebrate and get drunk. And on the night of the wedding, he switches and gives him his other daughter, Leah. And he tricks Jacob. And Jacob's upset. And he says, why would you do this awful thing to me? And Laban says, look, in our custom, you don't give the youngest daughter away before giving the oldest daughter away. And so they finished the week-long celebration of the marriage so that Leah could get pregnant. And then he goes, look, if you offer me another 7 years, I'll give you Rebekah. So then Jacob says, okay. And then he marries Rebekah, or marries Rachel, rather. And so he has 2 weeks of weddings with 2 women, and then he has 14 years of service to their father. And over that time, he builds a lot of wealth, but Laban continues to cheat him. And they get to a point where they come to an agreement where Jacob says, look, I have all these children now, and I need to be able to have something of my own and not just work for you to be able to provide for my family, as he has 11 children at this point. So they cut this deal, and Laban goes back on it again and steals from Jacob. And 6 years later, Jacob has had enough, and God has blessed him, regardless of the fact that over 20 years, he's never really acknowledged God in his life. He has walked 20 years in his own way, making God meet every expectation of his, doing exactly what he said at that stone, unrighteously demanding God to say, oh, you're going to be with me and you're going to bless me when I do life my way. And God, in his mercy and his love for Jacob, and because of his word to Jacob, actually blesses him. Not because he has to, not because Jacob earned it or deserved it, but because of God's love for Jacob, for God's love for his name and his promise to the whole earth to be blessed through Jacob and Jacob's children. God blesses Jacob anyways, and Jacob never acknowledges it. And so finally, Jacob leaves, and Laban catches him down. They have this big confrontation, and they get through it. And I'm speeding through this story a little bit to save time. And he gets back towards home, and he has all this wealth and all this possession. He has his children with him, and he hears word. He sends messengers to his brother telling him that he's coming back in. And he hears word that Esau is now coming and pursuing him with 400 men. With 400 men, and he knows that Esau's coming to fulfill his promise 20 years earlier, that he's coming to kill him. And so Jacob takes again in this last moment, instead of going to God, Jacob comes to this place where he takes all his possessions and he separates them into 2 camps, and he sends this huge gift to Esau. And then he sends waves of people. They're saying, your brother loves you and he's coming, and he's trying to appease Esau, and he's sending these waves of things towards Esau. And then he sends his own family without himself. He's preserving himself, and he sends his own family, and he finds himself alone again. He finds himself alone after all his wittiness, after all his strength that he's acquired, after all the things and the wealth he has. He finds himself 20 years, a full circle in this place where he's alone in the wilderness again with just his staff. With just his staff. And I think this is an image we need to understand before we get into kind of the crux of the message today, that finding the ability to fulfill our responsibility is not in us. It's not in us. You see, Jacob has done all these things. He's deceived and cheated to get promises and inheritance. He's worked hard to get wealth, and he has ran from danger, and he's outwitted the enemies left and right. And yet he finds himself, after probably at this point 35 years of doing it his way, he has nothing. He has possessions. He has all this experience. He has knowledge. He has skills. But in this moment, facing a danger bigger than himself, an opposition that he has no more hope, his back is up against a wall, and there's nowhere for him to run, he finally comes to the place where he has nothing left. And it's important for us to come to this place that we can produce in our own effort, in our own strength, in our own wittiness. We can deceive, we can lie, and we can gather natural resources and we can do things. But for us to see the promises of God and actually have peace where fear is quenched in our life, we cannot rely on any of those things. And so Jacob finds himself on the river of Jabbok alone with a staff, full circle. All his efforts have led him nowhere. He's back on his way home. The enemy isn't one man, it's 400 men now. And he has nothing to show for it, no hope in his strength or his wittiness. And a man comes to wrestle with him. And this is a famous story that many of you probably know. So let's pick up in Genesis 32, verse 24. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said to Jacob, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said to him, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man said to him, "What is your name?" Or Jacob said to him, "What is your name?" And he said to Jacob, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." And he said to him, "Why is it that you ask for my name?" And there he blessed him. And so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." It's an interesting story that Jacob wrestles with God. He says he's seen God face to face. And God says, "You've wrestled with man and with God, and you have prevailed." Even with nothing, Jacob starts this evening out in this encounter with God, the second encounter really of his life, powerful encounter of his life. He starts out wrestling, trying to do what he's always done, which is take what he has been given freely, but take it by force, take it by cleverness, and work in his own power instead of trusting the goodness of God to provide what he has for him. And Jacob comes to this place to where he's actually prevailing over the Lord. And the Lord cannot prevail over him, and he actually has to injure him and touch his hip to cause it to come out of socket. So all his strength is taken from him. He can no longer wrestle. And the only thing he has left to do is to cling to this man and say, "Bless me." And the man says, "What's your name?" And Jacob said, "It's Jacob." And Jacob, for the first time in his life, for the first time, the humility comes through, for the first time, a sign of potential repentance and acknowledgement that he has been guilty all these years of striving for himself. He says, "I'm Jacob. I am the deceiver. I am the one who trips people up. I am the one who strives in my own strength and understanding." And in that place of repentance, or in that place of humility, of acknowledging that Jacob has caused himself to have all these highs and all these lows, but ultimately has nothing to offer, he finally gets the blessing through clinging to the man. Not through working, not through striving out of his own cleverness, but coming to a place where he has nothing left and he clings to the man. He says, and he comes to this realization that the only hope I have is this God man in front of me, that I hold on to him and him alone, and be blessed. Because without his blessing, everything I have has gone before me, and all my enemies are coming toward me. And I want to read to you guys something that is really what the Lord spoke to me in my quiet time as I was praying about this 3 days ago. And in the church, actually, I was in the sanctuary alone, and I was pacing and praying. And this is what I felt like the Lord wanted me to share with you guys this morning. And so I'm just going to read it as I wrote it down. Jacob, when wrestling with God on the riverbank, came to a place where he had no more ability to strive over God. So he clung to the God-man instead, and he begged him to bless him according to the promise he had received 20 years earlier in the dream. Jesus in John 15 tells the disciples to abide. The word abide also can be translated to cling. Jesus is calling us to cling to him as Jacob had to learn to do on that riverbank. He's calling us to come to the end of ourselves and our wittiness and our cleverness and all the things we rely on ourselves to produce the promises of God, or the peace or the security or the provision that we think we need, or we think God should manifest in our understanding and in our ways, and come to the place where we just go, "Jesus, I cling to you and you alone." God showed Jacob, or Jesus says that his promises in John 15 are abiding in us, and that they are therefore clinging to us out of his steadfast love for us. In the same breath, when Jesus says this, he calls us to cling to him as our only hope for our fulfillment. And this Jesus also says in this moment when we're clinging to him that we can ask anything in his name, according to his authority and his promises. We can ask anything in his name and his Father will do it. Just like how Jacob asked the Lord while he clung to him for the promises and blessings that were spoken over him early in his life by his father and by God himself in the dream. And in that moment, Jacob realizes something as he clings to God for the first time in his life. Instead of clinging to his efforts and he receives the promises, he receives something else, a new name. He's no longer the deceiver, for the man calls Jacob and says, "You are no longer Jacob." He says, "Your name is Israel," one who has striven with God and man and prevailed. He is one who strove to cling to God. And because he clung to God, he prevailed. You see, the wrestling with God is really a wrestling with ourselves in light of his promises and the power to fulfill them. We must come to the place where we have striven against ourselves, against the man in the mirror, and against God, and prevailed in the understanding that we have nothing to offer and no hope without Jesus. We must strive to cling to Jesus in all things, to find ourselves completely alone with him and holding on to him and his promises no matter what the circumstances and what is transpired in our lives behind us and what lies before us. This is the place where God's blessings really flow, when we let go of our ability and step into his. This is where our identity changes from people who walk in fear and struggle and strive for blessings to those who walk by faith and trust in the goodness of God to fulfill every word he's spoken. We need to come to the realization that we have nothing of ourselves to offer as a solution for our own problems. We must come to the end of ourselves and completely rely on Jesus in this way. The coming to the end of ourselves does not mean that we passively sit back and wait for Jesus to do everything without our participation. That we sit and wait for God to do things and let our hands be folded idly, hoping that God's provision and promises just fall in our lap. But what it means is we have to simply come to the place where we acknowledge and move in faith from a place where we know in our mind and our heart that we lack the ability to complete the responsibility we've been given. Just like Jacob had a responsibility as a father, as a husband, as one of the heirs of God's promises to see God's promises be fulfilled in his lifetime and extended, and yet he lacked the ability to do it. We need to come to this place where we understand we have no ability to fulfill our responsibility, yet a responsibility still remains on us. So we must respond. We must apply our ability with anxious futility and end up like Jacob did, or how so many of us have in so many circumstances of our life, stressed out, overwhelmed, and feeling a sense of constant failure. Or we can respond with God's ability to fulfill our responsibility. It is a response in faith to God's promises that moves us to act in faith that God's ability will sustain us, empower us, and overcome whatever we are facing. This truth has played out in each one of our lives where we have come to the end of ourselves. Hopefully, we have experienced that, where we've come to the end of ourselves and seen God's goodness. I've seen it in my marriage. I've seen it in ministry. And right now, I'm being faced with it in business and ministry again, as circumstances in our world and things are changing constantly, to come to a place that where my best for you, my best for God, my best for my family, my best for this community is for me to come to the end of myself and just cling to Jesus, to give all my cares, all my anxieties to him, and be reasonable with what's going on around me because Daddy's here, like we talked about a few weeks ago. To come to a place where I understand that God is in control. Oh, so in control, more than we realize. It's interesting to look at Israel, the nation, and that this moment on the riverbank has prophetically walked itself out over and over again over history. You see, the prophets would speak for God, and God would call Israel, Israel, and Jacob, Jacob, and Israel back and forth as they wavered in their identity and they wavered in their efforts to sustain themselves or to trust God over all their generations. And all the outcomes reflected whoever they were in that time. And ultimately, they strove against man and against God one last time and prevailed. As when Jesus walked the earth, the God man in the flesh, God in the flesh as a human being, in Israel, Jacob the deceivers laid trap after trap for Jesus and failed to catch him, and yet they still wrestled with him and prevailed as they crucified him on a cross. But it came at a cost, just like it came at a cost to Jacob on the riverbank. And their strength was taken from them. For 40 years later, after Jesus was crucified, Israel would have their temple destroyed and their nation taken from them. And they would never be a nation again up until just recently in this last century. You see, they ended up having to walk with a limp as well and given two choices: to either trust God and his provision and promises through the Messiah, Jesus Christ, or to continue to trust in themselves and their rituals and their sacrifices and their understanding and their cleverness and strength and try to fulfill the promises that have already been fulfilled through Christ and continue to walk in darkness. And we have that same opportunity before us today, family, as we deal with the various things going on in our life. Individually, as we deal with anxiety and struggles, we can either choose to come to the end of ourselves, to really wrestle with ourselves and go, God, I need to come to this place where I acknowledge and I submit that I have nothing to offer myself to fulfill the own desires of my heart or to fulfill the promises and the callings that you've put on my life. We come to that place of submission to him, to completely acknowledging our lack of ability. And God gives us a new name. He gives us influence and power through his Holy Spirit to be able to walk these things out and to do all that we are called to do. For that has been his promise from the beginning, that he would go before us and he would never leave us and never forsake us, and he would bring us to the place he has called us to. In the same way, he's calling us right now, church, as a people, to consider our lives and to consider him as the king of our life, because the world is waiting and groaning for the sons of God to be revealed. The world is waiting for you to come to the end of yourself and for me to come to the end of myself and acknowledge that all that I have to offer is the promise and the power of God that lives within me through Jesus Christ. And in that, the world can see the hope of something more than they've ever had, the hope that goes beyond anything they've ever been able to strive and contend for in their own strength. And we can see the goodness of God in the land of the living. You see, Jacob ended this story with coming and meeting his brother and falling on his face in humility for the first time in his life. And his brother threw his arms around him and kissed him and blessed him and refused the gifts and said, "Come, dwell in the land." And Jacob came and inherited the land his father gave him in peace. You see, God has an outcome for each and every one of us, no matter what our circumstances are, that when we truly turn ourselves over to him and trust in him, he will bring us to the promises he has for us, the promises he has for his church, his bride, and he will do so in peace. There's contention along the way. There's real fears and real struggles along the way, but God is faithful. He's looking for a people. He's looking for me to come to a place to where I'm done struggling in my own efforts, worrying about outcomes that I have no control over, and fighting for things that I can't find victory in myself. To really come to a place of going, God, I'm going to cling to you no matter what. I'm going to cling to you no matter what the circumstances alone, because the way I came into this world, I'm going to leave it. And you're the only hope I have. Would you pray with me today, church, and just let whatever the anxiety and the stresses in your life land before the Lord's feet, and just come to the place of recognizing and receiving that God is abiding in you because of his steadfast love, and his promises over you are true because of his faithfulness and goodness and kindness towards you. You're his beloved child. He wants to bless you. He wants to pour out mercy and grace. But he will not strive and overwhelm us if we desire to contend in our own strength. He will allow us to prevail often in our strength and endure many hardships that he never intended. But he has promises and goodness for those who just come and yield themselves more than we could ever imagine or ever asked for out of his abundance of love for us. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much. I thank you for the last 2 weeks of being sick and dealing with struggles in business, struggles with family, struggles with the church, and Lord, that you have made it abundantly clear that I do not have the ability to overcome in any of them. And if I do, the cost would be too great of myself, too much wandering in the pride of my own soul, even if I were to find victory. And Lord, I thank you that you have steered me so quickly back to a place of being alone with you and coming to a place of knowing that, Daddy, you're here and clinging to you is the only hope I have. Lord, right now I ask as everyone who is sitting and listening to this, whether it be here Sunday night or sometime in the future, Lord, that you are present right now. And whatever anxieties, whatever worries, whatever circumstances that are too big for whoever's watching this, Lord, that they can just cast it before you, Lord. They can send it out and know that right now, just you and them, that you are clinging to them, that your favor and love is flowing towards them, Lord, and that they would just come to the end of themselves and their efforts, their expectations of how you'll work, and they would just trust you in this moment. That Jesus, you would speak a new name over them, that you would speak your destiny and your favor over them. Because in the end, Lord, you will strive over sin and death, and you will be victorious because you were victorious on that cross, and you'll come back and you'll put death under your feet, and all the things that fear is based in will be wiped away. And Lord, you have power even now in the goodness of your promises. You promise in the gospel that you have come to restore life even now. And so, Lord, I just pray as people are clinging to you, as releasing their anxieties and their circumstances, the power of your peace that surpasses understanding is flowing over people as they come to the revelation that their daddy is here. That daddy is here and his arms are around them, and that there is no way for them to go other than to you. For you are a good, good father, and you always take care of your kids. And we thank you. We declare these things according to your word. In Jesus' name. God bless you, City Church. We will see you next week, 4 o'clock. I can't wait. I miss you guys. I can't remember the last time I went 2 weeks without seeing so many of your faces. It'll be 3 weeks by the time we actually meet on Sunday. I love you. You are loved. Love one another. Continue to strive to cling to God. He is always faithful and good. Be blessed.